A sitting president collapsed in front of millions, not because of war, not because of scandal, but because of a single question, whispered through a phone line from a man halfway across the world. J.D. Vance had no idea his words would trigger the most emotional moment ever captured in African political history. With 14 cameras rolling and the world watching in silence, Ibrahim Traoré, known for his iron will and calm under fire, broke down. Tears streamed down his face, not of weakness, but of recognition, of a truth too heavy to carry alone. What did J.D. Vance say? Why now? And why, of all people, did the president of Burkina Faso crumble in front of the very nation he vowed to protect? This is not just a story about power. It's a story about what happens when words hit harder than weapons. And while what you're about to hear is a dramatization based on fictional events, the emotions are deeply real, and the questions it raises about leadership, empathy, and responsibility are ones we can no longer afford to ignore. Because sometimes the most powerful battles don't happen on battlefields. Stay with us, because sometimes the stories we imagine reveal truths we've tried too long to forget. Ouagadougou breathed differently at night. The heat, though ever present, softened slightly as darkness blanketed the capital. But tonight, the city pulsed. A strange tension floated through the air, not the kind born of danger, but of anticipation. Studio 4 of Télé Nationale de Faso shimmered with stage lights, microphones, and the hum of thousands watching from home. Inside, the set was simple but reverent. Wooden trim, deep golds, and rich red fabrics wrapped the room in warmth. One side held the audience, students, teachers, farmers, military officers, all invited to be part of this special national conversation. At the center, a low stage, a desk, 2 chairs, and a glowing sign above, "The People Speak." It wasn't a stiff political talk show, no shouting pundits, no polished propaganda. This was the kind of program people actually watched, where presidents had to speak like people, not politicians. Then he appeared. President Ibrahim Traoré walked in without fanfare, without military guards, without even a tie. Just a quiet navy shirt, sleeves rolled, and a simple lapel pin bearing the flag. But somehow that made the room sit straighter. His presence wasn't loud. It was anchored, measured. Like gravity had a personal relationship with him. The host stood to greet him, Jérôme Bacot, a man known for his velvet voice and cunning questions. With an ear-to-ear grin, he clapped Traoré's shoulder and led him to the chair with a casual, "Welcome, Mr. President. No speeches tonight, just conversation." The cameras rolled. Red lights blinked. The audience leaned in. Traoré smiled, small but genuine. "I wouldn't dream of giving a speech, Jérôme. You invited me here for honesty, not applause." The crowd laughed softly. Already the tone was set. Tonight's topic was rural education, but something felt different. The script lay on the desk, but Jérôme hadn't opened it once. The camera kept catching him tapping his fingers, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. After 20 minutes of heartfelt discussion about chalk shortages in Bobo Dioulasso, teenage girls forced to drop out, a village school with only one book, Traoré turned suddenly contemplative. "I remember walking 5 kilometers each morning just to sit on a cement floor," he said. "We didn't have electricity, but we had hope. That was the light." A wave of murmurs passed through the crowd. This wasn't a line from a PR team. This was a man speaking from the marrow of memory. Jérôme nodded slowly, then looked down at a card slipped into his palm by a backstage hand. "And Mr. President," he said carefully, "before we go to break, we promised the audience a surprise tonight." Traoré raised an eyebrow. "A surprise?" Jérôme grinned like a man hiding a live firecracker. "Well, not from me, but from someone who's been watching your leadership very closely, from far away. Let's just say, not everyone who admires you lives in Africa." A low ripple moved through the studio. Some looked toward the stage's side curtains, others up to the rafters where the tech crew stood. "And this someone," Jérôme continued, insisted on joining us tonight. In fact, he's on the line now. Waiting. Traoré blinked. His calm remained, but a subtle shift appeared behind his eyes. Interest, then caution, then something else. Something the cameras caught but couldn't explain. "Is this a prank?" he asked, half laughing. Jerome chuckled. "No, sir. This is very real. And I think what he has to say might just change the rest of this night." The studio dimmed, a slow zoom on Traoré's face. And then, without further warning, the phone rang. The studio stood still. Not silent. Still, like the air had thickened, like every breath taken had been temporarily borrowed. On the screen behind President Ibrahim Traoré, the words "incoming live call, J.D. Vance, U.S. Senator, Ohio," lit up in bold. There was a sharp intake of breath from the crowd. Someone in the front row dropped a pen. No one moved to pick it up. J.D. Vance? Live? Now? Even Traoré blinked twice, his composure shifting almost imperceptibly. But for a man so measured, even the flicker of an eyebrow was a tremor. The screen changed. There he was, Senator J.D. Vance, in real time, from what looked like a quiet, wood-paneled office somewhere in Washington, D.C. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't performing. If anything, he looked uncomfortably human. Not the man many in Africa knew from cable news headlines or Senate soundbites. His tie was loosened, his eyes a touch darker than usual. The hum of some late-night hour sat behind him. And then he spoke. "Mr. President," he said plainly, directly, "I owe you an apology, and something more." You could feel the temperature in the studio shift. The host, Jérôme Bacot, leaned slightly forward in his chair, forgetting his own rehearsed lines. Even the cameraman zoomed in without being told, instinctively drawn to the gravity in Vance's voice. Traoré didn't speak. Not yet. He simply folded his hands gently in his lap and waited. Vance continued. "Years ago," he said, "I watched you speak at the United Nations. I was just a freshman senator then. I didn't agree with your politics. I thought I had it all figured out." He paused, letting the sentence breathe. "But that day, something cracked open in me. You didn't speak with diplomacy. You spoke with dignity. You talked about sacrifice, about refusing to leave your country behind, even when they threatened your life. And I remember thinking, who is this man, and why does he sound more like an American than most of my colleagues back home?" A soft ripple moved through the crowd. Amusement, maybe, but it quickly gave way to silence again. This wasn't a press stunt. This was something else, something unfiltered. "I never reached out. I should have. But I let politics get in the way. I let pride stop me from saying something simple, that you reminded me why I ran for office in the first place, why we're here, or supposed to be." Vance's voice, and still calm, trembled slightly on the edge of something deeper. Not regret, not exactly, but a recognition of how far one can drift without even noticing. Traoré tilted his head, still silent. "I came on tonight not to debate, not to defend my record, not even to be understood," Vance said. "I came on because something's happening in your country, something hard, something noble, and I wanted you to hear from a man halfway across the world that I saw it and that I see you." The camera shifted to Traoré, whose eyes, unsteady all night, now flickered with something rare, something unnameable. The audience hadn't breathed in minutes. "And if you'll let me," J.D. added, "I'd like to offer something more than words, a kind of partnership, one that isn't bound by flags or borders, but by principle." Before Traoré could respond, Jérôme raised a hand gently, buying them all one more second of silence. And in that second, a single question bloomed across every face in the room. What could possibly come next? For a long second, there was no sound. Only the gentle hum of studio lights and the soft intake of breath from those two moved to pretend otherwise. The camera held steady on President Ibrahim Traoré. His expression hadn't changed much, and yet it had changed completely. His shoulders still square, his posture still upright, but his eyes, they had shifted, not away from the screen, not into himself, but into something deeper, as if staring at the invisible weight of years he never meant to carry this far. J.D. Vance, still visible on the large screen behind him, spoke once more. Not louder, but lower, with the tone of someone returning to a place he once left behind. "I remember that moment," Vance said quietly. "Watching you at the United Nations." He let the words settle. "You weren't yelling. You weren't pleading. You didn't demand anything. You just stood there, still, your hands behind your back. And somehow you held the entire room. People more powerful than you. People richer, older, louder. But they listened, not because they had to, but because your presence reminded them what they'd forgotten." Vance's eyes lowered slightly, as if the memory was both a reverence and a reckoning. "You reminded me what it meant to serve, not to rule." At that, Traoré's breath caught. It was barely visible, a soft motion in the throat, a tightening of the jaw. But to anyone who knew him, anyone who'd followed this young soldier-turned-leader who spoke in bullets and books, who wore no medals yet carried whole villages on his back, it was the first crack. The kind of crack that doesn't signal weakness, but the breaking open of something long sealed. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. Instead, his eyes blinked once, then again, and then they didn't blink at all, just wide, still and full. Moisture gathered fast and without apology, and then it happened. A single tear, just one. No sound, no sobbing, not even a shift in posture. But there it was, on national television, on a night meant to discuss rural schools, in front of millions across Africa, and now the world. A revolutionary cried. Not because he was defeated, not because he was wounded, but because, after so long fighting to be heard, his truth had reached a man he never expected. A man who once represented everything distant and immovable. And now that man was calling him teacher. The studio didn't move. Not a whisper, not a cough. As if every person in that room knew they were witnessing something that didn't happen twice in a lifetime. "I didn't expect this call to break me," JD said softly. "But maybe I needed to be broken. Maybe more of us do." Traoré exhaled. Not a sigh, not relief, just release. He raised his gaze slightly toward the ceiling lights above, blinking hard once, willing himself to anchor the moment. He was not the boy soldier anymore. He was not the refugee leader scrambling for electricity in schoolhouses. He was not the whispered name behind closed doors. He was here, and he was seen, by someone who once would have walked past him without a second glance. When Traoré finally spoke, his voice was raw and almost inaudible. "I didn't think anyone outside would hear me that day," he said. "I just wanted my people to know they mattered." The host said nothing. The crew didn't cue ads. No graphics danced across the screen, because the truth needed no graphics. And in that quiet, where even the machines seemed to hush themselves, a question rose, not from a script, not from a segment rundown, but from the collective soul of the people watching. If a tear could carry the weight of a country, what else had we ignored until it broke us open? Long before that tear fell from President Traoré's eye, before the studio lights dimmed in reverence, before the world held its breath in unison, there was a night in Washington, D.C., where one man sat alone, gripped not by cameras but by conscience. It was 2:11 a.m. J.D. Vance hadn't moved from his chair in hours. The glow of his office screen lit his face, casting tired shadows beneath eyes that had stopped blinking. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled to the elbow, coffee cold beside untouched notes. On the monitor, the same video replayed for the third time. Traoré's address to the United Nations General Assembly 2 years prior. There were no dramatic gestures in that speech, no fire and brimstone politics. Just a man, young, composed, deliberate, standing before a room of diplomats and decision-makers, speaking softly of dignity, land, and forgotten voices. And it wasn't what Traoré said that haunted JD. It was how he said it. "You looked into the camera," JD murmured to no one, his voice hoarse, "and it felt like you were talking to me." He rewound the video 10 seconds and hit play again. The same moment, the same pause between words, the same unblinking stare from Traoré, straight down the lens, across oceans, across systems, across ideologies, and into something JD wasn't sure he still had. Conviction. JD leaned back in his chair, eyes glassy, breath shallow. The Capitol dome outside his window gleamed in the darkness, but it no longer felt like a beacon. Lately, the Senate chamber had started to feel more like theater than service. Every handshake came with a camera. Every policy masked ambition. Every time he stood to speak, he felt his words slipping away from meaning. Somewhere along the way, he'd become fluent in the language of survival, but not of truth. And now a voice from Burkina Faso had shaken something loose. JD reached for his pen, scribbling on a yellow legal pad. "Why do I do this?" But he scratched it out, too soft. Then he tried again. "What would it mean to be honest, even once?" Another line through the words. Finally, he stopped writing. He stared at the frozen frame of Traoré on his screen. The eyes steady, the jaw set, the quiet that spoke louder than any filibuster he'd heard in years. And JD whispered the truth he hadn't admitted to anyone. "I don't know who I am when the microphones are off." His voice cracked. A pause, then, "But you did. That day, you were who you were. No pretense, no mask. And it ruined me." JD exhaled through his nose, slow and low, and leaned forward to replay the speech from the beginning, this time not as a senator or strategist, but as a man searching for a way back to something he had lost. It was that night, in that silence, with only the hum of the city outside and a flickering video on loop, that JD made his decision. He would reach out, not to be seen, not to be forgiven, but to speak plainly and publicly, to the only man whose voice had pierced the armor he'd worn for too long. That decision would set into motion the call the world had just watched, the tears, the silence, the unspoken recognition between two unlikely men. And while the audience had only seen the moment of impact, JD Vance knew it began much earlier, with a question too many leaders were afraid to ask. What if the truth wasn't in power, but in surrendering the illusion of it? The silence in the studio lingered long after JD Vance stopped speaking. President Traoré hadn't moved. His hands still rested lightly on his knees, but his shoulders were no longer square. They had softened, as if carrying something invisible yet immense. Behind him, the live call screen flickered slightly. The technician wasn't sure if he should cut the feed, but the director in the control room whispered, "Not yet. Something's coming," and something did. JD leaned closer to his webcam. His voice was steady, but quieter now, like someone lowering their tone before saying something sacred. "Mr. President," he began again, "what you said 2 years ago, it did more than move me. It rebuilt something in me I thought was gone." He paused, choosing his next words with the same deliberate care Traoré had shown at that UN podium. "I don't know if it's appropriate or even wise, but I want to make you a public offer." Traoré looked up, his expression unreadable. JD continued, "Come to Ohio. Let me name a leadership academy after you, a place where young Americans can learn that courage isn't American, it's human." The room inhaled sharply. The host's eyes darted from guest to screen. Someone in the back row gasped. Another murmured something in Mossy, barely audible. And for a second, just one, Traoré's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. JD went on. "They don't need another statue. They need a story. They need to see that strength isn't always loud, that leadership can be gentle, rooted, honest. They need to know that a boy from Ouagadougou can hold a room in Manhattan and change a man in Washington." Then he stopped talking, and all eyes turned to the man whose name now floated above a future that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. Traoré blinked slowly. The lights around him seemed brighter than before. The cameras felt hotter. The very air in the room had changed, like something sacred had entered. But his silence was not hesitation. It was searching. He thought of the obvious fallout, how this would be weaponized back home. Traoré sells out to the West. Symbolism over sovereignty. Headlines already wrote themselves in his mind. He imagined his cabinet's phone calls, the political knives being sharpened, the judgment waiting behind closed doors. But then, like a thread pulled from memory, a voice rose in his mind. Soft, worn, maternal. His mother's voice, aged but always clear when it mattered. "The truth that shakes enemies is the truth that heals them." She had said that to him when he was 13, after he refused to hit back at a soldier who'd struck his uncle during a protest. That night, while others called him weak. She placed her hand over his heart and whispered, "One day, this will terrify them more than your fists ever could." He swallowed hard. Then Traoré did something few expected. He smiled. It wasn't broad. It wasn't for the cameras. It was the kind of smile you make when you recognize your own reflection in a stranger. He looked directly at JD on the screen, then tilted the microphone toward him, not to accept, not yet, but to speak the first words since the offer. "Do you believe," he asked gently, "that America is ready to learn from a continent it once refused to listen to?" JD didn't flinch. "I think the students are." And in that moment, the world understood that what had just been said was more than an invitation. It was a pivot. The kind history books try to summarize in footnotes, but that whole generations carry in their bones. The applause had long faded, but backstage the silence was louder than any ovation. The set lights now dimmed, cameras off, chatter from technicians replaced by the distant hum of late-night generators outside the studio. President Ibrahim Traoré sat on a low wooden bench near the dressing mirror, not fixing his appearance, not reviewing the broadcast, just breathing. One hand rested on the armrest, the other clutched a wrinkled tissue, soaked from the center outward. His aide, Mamadou, stood quietly to the side, unsure whether to speak. For all the years they had traveled together, villages, war zones, UN corridors, he had never seen his president like this. Not when a convoy exploded, not when France withdrew, not even when the African Union left his name off the regional alliance ballot. Mamadou stepped closer, crouching slowly as if not to disturb something sacred. He placed a gentle hand on Traoré's shoulder and said softly, "You've made enemies cry before, but never like this." Then after a pause, he added, "And I've never seen you cry without anger behind it." Traoré didn't look up. He pressed the tissue to his eyes once more, then let out the faintest chuckle, half embarrassment, half release. "I'm not crying because of Vance," he whispered. "I'm crying because somewhere in America, a classroom might say my mother's name." He turned toward Mamadou now, finally meeting his gaze. His voice was no longer presidential. It was just a man's. "I'm not going as a president," he said. "I'm going as a son who once had nothing, and who once watched his mother wash the same white shirt every Sunday so her child could look like he belonged to a future." A silence followed that didn't need filling. Then Traoré stood up, wiped his face with a clean towel, and nodded once. Not in ceremony, but in certainty. "Mamadou," he said quietly, "clear my schedule." "Until when?" the aide asked. "Until I return from Ohio." There was a stunned beat. Mamadou blinked. "You mean no press, no cameras, no statements, no motorcade, no diplomatic mission?" Traoré said calmly. "Just me and that invitation." The aide hesitated. "Sir, with respect, this is not a simple gesture. If you go like that, there will be backlash. They'll say it's a betrayal, that you're humanizing an empire." Traoré gave him a long look, tired but resolute. "Let them. If a man has to be less human to be more powerful, then power is no longer worth holding." He walked to a dusty end table in the corner of the dressing room and picked up his phone. In a matter of minutes, he had opened a private browser, selected a discreet travel site, and booked a one-way ticket to Columbus, Ohio. Economy seat, no entourage. A false name known only to two officials. It wasn't protocol, but protocol had never changed the world. As the confirmation code lit up on the cracked screen, Traoré stared at it for a long while, like it wasn't a booking, but a threshold. Mamadou remained still, struggling between admiration and fear. "What do I tell the council?" Traoré's answer came slow but clear. "Tell them I'm going to visit the future, and that I will return with proof that it still wants us in it." And with that, he folded the towel neatly, placed it over the armrest, and walked out. Not flanked by guards, but followed by the quiet dignity of a decision few would ever fully understand. Before boarding the flight to Ohio, Ibrahim Traoré did something not even his closest advisors expected. With no announcement, no cameras, and no ceremony, he asked the driver to turn the car away from the capital's tarmac road and head north, toward Kaya, toward dust, toward memory. The paved roads gave way to cracked red earth, where the tires kicked up clouds that clung to the windows, like history refusing to be forgotten. He didn't speak much during the 4-hour journey, eyes locked on the changing landscape. Goats weaving through motorbikes, women balancing silver basins of mangoes on their heads, the occasional vendor waving roasted maize by the roadside. But as they neared the old village, something in his chest tightened, not with fear, but with reverence. The car stopped where roads no longer led. Traoré stepped out, leather shoes crunching on sun-hardened ground. He breathed in deeply. The air smelled of shea butter, smoke from firewood, and millet stew simmering somewhere nearby. It was the scent of childhood, of days when he'd fall asleep on woven mats with nothing but dreams and a grandmother's hum keeping him warm. Children ran barefoot through the brush, laughing with the kind of joy that didn't know politics or borders. One of them, small, dusty-faced, eyes too big for his face, stopped mid-run. He stared up at Traoré, squinting, as if recognizing something, not in the man, but in the silence that followed him. Traoré nodded to the child and walked past the houses, mud walls painted with white tribal patterns, doors crafted by hand from termite-scarred wood. He stopped before a hut shaded by a neem tree, its branches swaying gently as if in greeting. This was it, the home of Mama Hawa. He didn't knock. He simply crouched near the entrance and touched the worn threshold with his right hand. And just like that, the memory rose unbidden, vivid and sharp. He was 6, small even for his age, face streaked with tears and dust after being mocked by the older boys for not having a real mother. That afternoon he'd run here, scraped knee, trembling lip, and thrown himself into the arms of Mama Hawa, who held him like the world itself had no right to hurt him. "You don't need to fight to prove you belong," she had whispered, wiping his face with the edge of her sleeve. "Just learn. Just stand. One day even the ones who mocked you will follow your silence." That line had stayed with him like a bone under the skin, hidden but shaping everything. And now the silence returned. Not the political silence of negotiation rooms, but a soul-deep quiet as he sat beside the door of the woman who had taught him that dignity was not something given, but remembered. She had passed 5 years ago, long before he was elected president. He hadn't made it to her funeral. That grief still lived in the space between his ribs. So now, before stepping into America, before answering J.D. Vance, before becoming a symbol again, he had come back to ask permission. Not with words, but with presence, with gratitude. He placed a single white flower, a wild bloom he'd picked along the trail, at the foot of the doorway. Then he whispered, "I'm going, Mama, but not as a leader, as your boy, your little boy who finally knows what standing feels like." As he stood to leave, wind moved gently through the neem tree above, and though the village around him buzzed with the sounds of cooking pots, chicken calls, and distant radio static, he could swear, for one breathless second, the whole earth had paused to listen. But memory, once opened, does not close quietly. After laying the white flower at her doorway, Ibrahim didn't return to the car. His feet, seemingly guided by instinct rather than purpose, led him toward the old community school at the edge of the village, the same one where he had learned to read under a tin roof that groaned with every gust of wind. The building looked smaller now, its walls cracked and its painted letters faded. But the soul of it, the hum of learning, the smell of chalk and dust, the echo of recited lessons, still pulsed like a drumbeat. And then just beyond the open window, he saw her, Mama Hawa, 85, maybe older, a frame bent by time but never by surrender. She stood in the back of the classroom, sweeping the cracked concrete floor with a bundle of sticks bound by twine. Her hands moved in rhythm, slow and certain, like she had done it every day since the world began. He stood still, unable to speak, watching her back sway with each sweep, her scarf tied tightly against the Harmattan wind. And then, without turning, she said, in a voice as steady as thunder wrapped in velvet, "You came back, my lion." He inhaled sharply, caught between disbelief and reverence, only to remember where I began. She turned then, those eyes, deep-set and clouded, still holding the clarity of one who sees the soul before the skin. She did not rush to him. She did not collapse with emotion. She simply walked forward and placed one hand on his chest right above the heart. It is still there, she murmured. The ache that made you leave. The silence that made you strong. He lowered his head, eyes stinging. I didn't know what else to do. The world. It's asking more of me than I ever offered. And you are answering, she said, even when the question is cruel. Then she reached into the folds of her faded wrapper, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in linen. She unwrapped it slowly, like unsealing time itself. Inside was a piece of hand-woven scarf, faded red and gold, frayed at the edges, the fabric barely intact. You remember this? She asked. He frowned, then gasped. The first thing I ever wrapped your wounds with, she said, voice nearly a whisper now. You had fallen trying to chase a rooster through the thorn brush. You cried, but not because of pain, because you thought pain meant failure. And I told you, what did I say? He closed his eyes. You said, only those who fall learn how to rise with purpose. She nodded. And you've fallen many times since, my boy. But now you're not just rising, you're lifting others with you. He reached out, hands trembling, and accepted the scarf. It was light as air but carried the weight of everything that had shaped him. Mud paths, empty bellies, whispered lullabies. It was not just cloth. It was lineage. It was language. It was love made tangible. I need this, he said, his voice cracking. Not for them, for me. She leaned in close, pressing her forehead to his, just as she had when he was a child too afraid to sleep during thunder. Then wear it, she whispered. Let the world see that the man they follow was first a boy who bled, who healed, and who remembers. The call to prayer rang out from the village mosque then, soft and distant, as if even the sky paused to bless this moment. And when he stepped back toward the car that would take him to the airport, the scarf was in his breast pocket, visible, deliberate, sacred. The scarf, now folded neatly and resting close to his chest, seemed to breathe with him as he left Mama Hawa's hut behind. The village still dozed under the soft veil of dawn, but something in the air had changed. A quiet reverence hung in the dust, as though the earth itself had heard their exchange and vowed to remember. As Traoré approached the edge of the village, his pace slowed. The path narrowed into a line of cracked clay, flanked by baobab trees that had stood sentinel since before he was born. This was the road his feet once blistered upon barefoot, the road that led to wells, to hunger, to school, and now to something he didn't yet have a name for. But before the last tree, he stopped. The air was still, save for the distant rustling of leaves and the faint bleating of goats stirring awake. He looked behind him once more, not at the village, but at the invisible web of memory stretching across it. Mama Hawa's voice, the laughter of children echoing from rooftops, the rhythm of pots being scrubbed against stones. All of it would travel with him, but not as noise, as prayer. He dropped to one knee, slowly, reverently, his left hand pressed to the soil, dry, cracked, familiar, his right to the scarf against his chest. And then, eyes closed, he whispered, "Let me carry your love to a place that forgot what it means to feel." He didn't ask for strength, not this time. What he needed wasn't armor, it was openness, a heart unclenched, the courage to be soft in a world that had mistaken cruelty for clarity. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it answered. A breeze passed, warm and gentle, brushing past his cheek like the hand of someone long gone. He opened his eyes slowly, and for the briefest moment, it felt as though the land itself had nodded, as if it too understood. His aide waited at the edge of the field where the government SUV idled. No motorcade, no flags, no press corps to document this journey. That was the point. Inside the car, Traoré barely spoke. His fingers traced the hem of the scarf in quiet rhythm. When they reached the airstrip, little more than a wide dirt lane beside the tall grass, the plane was already waiting, its silver body reflecting the blue-gold sky that was beginning to awaken. The pilot, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, saluted wordlessly as Traoré stepped aboard. There were only 5 seats inside. 4 were empty. He chose the one by the window. As the engine stirred and the wings began to rise from the dirt, Ibrahim kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. His village disappeared quickly, just a smudge of color, a memory from the sky. But what lingered wasn't the image. It was the promise, the whispered vow. This was not a diplomatic trip, not a headline grab, not a gesture. This was a return disguised as departure. He was going to a land that spoke English but often heard nothing, a place full of ambition but hollow with doubt, a country that had taught the world to dream in superlatives, yet struggled to dream in compassion. And somewhere there, in a classroom or a farm or a sidewalk lost to rust, a young soul was waiting, one who didn't yet know they needed this meeting. Traoré closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to feel. The plane ascended, and the screen faded to black. The moment the jet's wheels touched American soil, the storm had already arrived. It didn't wait for handshakes, for red carpets, or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. No sooner had Traoré stepped off the plane, anonymous, unannounced, wrapped in the same scarf Mama Hawa gave him, than the American media machine roared to life. J.D. Vance honors African socialist? Blared the headlines, some in screaming red banners, others cloaked in passive-aggressive curiosity. Is Ohio now a platform for foreign radicals? Asked one cable network host with gleaming hair and venom behind his grin. Within hours, clips of Vance's invitation were sliced, spun, and broadcast across every conservative talk show from Cleveland to the far-right echo chambers of Arizona. They didn't mention the UN speech. They didn't mention Mama Hawa or the scarf. They didn't replay the quiet strength that brought a senator to tears. Instead, they snatched up a single phrase, Leadership Academy, named after Ibrahim Traoré. And from there, they built a pyre of outrage. Talk radio lit the first match. He's rewarding an outsider for talking down to America, barked one Ohio shock jock whose voice could rattle a windshield. Why not name a school after George Washington or Ronald Reagan? Why an African revolutionary? Others piled on, not with facts, but with fear. This is how socialism starts. One academy, one statue, and suddenly they're teaching our kids to hate our country. And then came the protests. By dawn the next day, a small crowd had already gathered outside the Ohio State Capitol. By noon, it had swelled into hundreds. American flags, red hats, handwritten signs shouting in black ink, "No foreign idols, America first. Vance betrayed us." The chants were loud, but the emotion behind them louder. Decades of economic anxiety, cultural confusion, and political cynicism had found a new lightning rod, and his name was Ibrahim Traoré. Inside the state capitol, aides to J.D. Vance scrambled to respond. Statements were written, rewritten, torn apart. Phone lines blew up. Funders threatened to withdraw. An emergency press team was formed overnight. "He's not coming to preach," one spokesperson said at a hastily arranged press briefing. "He's coming to inspire." But no one cared for nuance. Not in that climate. Not when outrage sold. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all sat silently in a borrowed brick house just outside Columbus. No guards, no press, no motorcade. Just the scarf, and the sound of a nation wrestling with itself. In that quiet house, Traoré watched the protests from a small TV in the corner. The volume was low, but the message was unmistakable. Signs calling him a foreign pawn. Crowds accusing him of being anti-American. None of it was new to him. He'd seen such faces before, in different countries, painted with different flags, but the same fear. He turned off the TV. And in that moment, he didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. Because when a truth begins to shake the room, the first sound you hear is always shouting. The house was quiet. No cameras, no aides, no headlines. Just the soft clinking of porcelain and the scent of mint leaves steeping in a chipped ceramic teapot. J.D. Vance poured 2 cups, his hands steady but his eyes restless. Across from him, seated with a quiet stillness that disarmed rather than threatened, sat Ibrahim Traoré. They hadn't spoken since the storm began. "I thought it would die down," J.D. said, finally breaking the silence. "I thought maybe people would listen, understand." Traoré didn't respond right away. He looked down at the tea, the swirl of steam rising like a ghost between them. "They don't want to understand," J.D. admitted. "They want me to walk this back. Every donor, every committee, every strategist. They want me to say I made a mistake." He leaned back in his chair, the weight of compromise beginning to crack his spine. They say it's political suicide, that I'm handing the next election to someone who'll undo everything. Ibrahim raised his eyes, calm but direct. Then walk with me instead. The words hung in the air like incense, soft, fragrant, and dangerously flammable. JD blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. You think that's a choice I can make? I think, Ibrahim said quietly, that you already made it when you invited me. JD looked away, eyes tracing the window where the blinds were half closed to keep out the press vans still circling outside. My loyalty is supposed to be to this country, to its people. Traoré nodded slowly. And what is loyalty to country if not loyalty to truth? You call this democracy, then let them see what courage looks like when it's inconvenient. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Just the tick of the old wall clock, just the steam rising, just the silence of two men raised on different soils, now standing in the same storm. JD finally whispered, "They'll crucify me for this. You're not the first to be crucified for standing still while the world wanted you to bow." JD almost smiled, but it wasn't joy. It was the strange ache of being seen. Across from him, Traoré took a slow sip of tea. In my country, we say a leader is not measured by the enemies he makes, but by the truce he carries. JD looked into his own cup and saw his reflection, tired, bruised, but alive. They'll call me un-American. They already have, Ibrahim said gently, so stop trying to silence the noise. Instead, speak over it. Outside, the wind began to pick up. Reporters moved closer to the gate, their cameras adjusting, their microphones ready. The country wanted a soundbite, a scandal, a retreat. Instead, inside that modest house, two men made a decision, quietly, without applause, without headlines, to walk forward, together, and the cost, it would come later. But for now, truth had company. The podium stood alone for a long moment before JD Vance walked out. The press room was packed, shoulder to shoulder with flashing cameras, murmuring correspondents, red-faced pundits, and staffers with eyes like they hadn't slept in days. Outside the building, the chanting hadn't stopped for hours. Protesters clashed in pockets, flags, fists in fury. America was watching, and JD knew this was the moment he couldn't walk back from. He adjusted the mic, paused. Then he began, his voice firm but stripped of ceremony. If standing beside a man of honor is betrayal, then so be it. There was a sharp silence. The reporters didn't even write at first. Some looked at each other, unsure if he'd misspoken. JD didn't clarify. He just pressed forward. This week I broke ranks, not with my country, but with the version of it that rewards conformity over courage. I met a man who reminded me why I entered public service in the first place. A man who, despite oceans of difference, believes in something we've forgotten. That service is not about power. It's about truth. A ripple went through the room. JD reached into his folder, pulled out a single document. I am proud to announce the founding of the Traoré Institute for Global Leadership, headquartered right here in Ohio. Its mission will be simple: raise a generation that values listening more than labeling and integrity over influence. That's when the room erupted. Some jumped to their feet, clapping. Others shouted over each other, arms raised, demanding answers, demanding clarity, demanding why. JD stood his ground. He didn't flinch. A reporter barked, "Senator, are you not concerned this will cost you re-election?" Another yelled, "Do you believe your actions align with American values?" A third asked, "Why Traoré? Why now?" JD Vance leaned into the chaos, his eyes sharp, his voice calm. Because there's a child watching this broadcast right now who's never seen an apology between two men on opposite sides of history. And maybe, just maybe, that child will grow up thinking that honor isn't weakness. And that was it. He stepped away from the mic. No Q&A, no handlers, no spin. The room remained a war zone of sound. Some cheered louder, others stormed out. By the time JD reached the elevator, the messages had already begun flooding his phone. Texts from colleagues, missed calls from donors, emails marked urgent, walk this back. And then the flood of hate mail. One message read, "You're done." Another, "Hope that African buys you votes." And one that simply said, "Traitor." But also, another message, just one line. No sender name. I saw my son cry. He never cries. He said you made him believe in good again. JD stared at the screen. He exhaled. In the war between comfort and conscience he had chosen. Not because it was strategic, not because it was safe, but because the fire had already been lit, and the only thing left to do was stand in it. Not for applause, not for legacy, but because sometimes doing the right thing means burning the playbook and building something honest from the ashes. And so the foundation began, not in a moment of peace, but in the middle of the storm, exactly where it belonged. The plane touched down on the reddish earth of Ouagadougou just before sunset. The heat wasn't the kind that scorched. It hugged the skin, slow and thick with memory. J.D. Vance stepped out behind Traoré, blinking into the brightness. The tarmac smelled of dust and diesel, of something wild and rooted. This was not his world, and yet somehow he didn't feel foreign. They didn't travel with an entourage, no flags, no press. Just two men in plain clothes walking down a dirt road toward a house whose roof was patched with rusted tin and whose walls had seen decades of rain and resolve. Is she expecting us? J.D. asked. Traoré smiled. Mama doesn't expect. She receives. They turned the corner into a sunlit clearing. There, seated on a low wooden stool beneath the shade of a neem tree, was Mama Hawa. She was older than any photo J.D. had seen. Her back curved now, hands slower, but her eyes still burned like coals that had never gone cold. She didn't rise when they approached. She didn't need to. Her presence stood taller than either of them. When she looked up at Ibrahim, her face lit. You came back, my lion. He knelt, head bowed. Only to remember where I began. Mama Hawa cupped his face. I knew the wind would bring you home again. Then she turned to J.D. Her eyes narrowed with the caution of a mother who had seen many men make promises, then vanish when the wind changed. Who is this one? She asked, voice laced with mischief. J.D. opened his mouth, but Traoré beat him to it. Just a student, he said, grinning. Mama Hawa cackled. You finally brought me one. J.D. chuckled, unsure whether to bow, extend his hand, or simply stand there and absorb this. He did a bit of all three. Mama Hawa simply patted the ground beside her. Sit, student. The dust will not kill you. They sat in silence for a while. No rush, no explanations. A goat bleated in the distance. Children laughed somewhere off behind the trees. The sky deepened to orange. Traoré pulled something from his bag, a folded piece of fabric. He handed it to her quietly. She touched it with trembling fingers. You kept it, she whispered. The scarf I used on your wounds. He nodded. And they never fully healed. J.D. watched, humbled. Here was the man who had stood at the UN, who had faced cameras and critics and kings. And here, in the presence of one old woman and a piece of worn cloth, he was once again a boy. Mama turned her attention back to J.D. And what brings an American senator to an old woman's stool? J.D. looked at her, then at Traoré, then back. A lesson I couldn't learn anywhere else. She studied him a long while, then said, Then I hope you are brave enough to be changed. That night they stayed in the village. No electricity, no speeches, no headlines, just firelight, the smell of stewed okra, and a silence that taught more than any vote or hearing ever could. J.D. didn't sleep much. Not because of discomfort, but because something in him was shifting. Something unwritten, unelected, and undeniable. And under the weight of stars and stories, he began to understand why the world needed this village more than it needed his Senate floor. The morning came quietly, wrapped in birdsong and wood smoke. J.D. awoke on a woven mat in a small side room, the air thick with the scent of boiled millet and damp clay walls. Outside, roosters crowed like they were announcing something sacred. He rose slowly, legs stiff from the hard floor, but his heart strangely light. In the kitchen, Mama Hawa was already up. A fire crackled beneath a blackened pot. She stood with her back to him, slicing okra with a small curved blade. Her hands moved with the memory of decades. No recipe, no hesitation, just rhythm and instinct. J.D. cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle her. She didn't turn. The lion still sleeps, she said, smiling. He chuckled. He warned me you'd be sharper than both of us combined. She turned then, wiping her hands on her skirt, and nodded toward a wooden bench near the stove. Come, sit. I'll tell you a story before the pot boils. JD sat, grateful for the warmth. The fire popped and hissed beside him. She began, her voice soft, as if she was recounting something still tender. It was the dry season, maybe 25 years ago. The earth was cracked. No rain for months. Mangoes were few, too few for children with empty bellies and mothers who had nothing to give. She stirred the pot slowly, not looking at him. That day I was tired. My knees ached. I had worked all morning to find leaves for soup. I came back with almost nothing, and I sat right where you are now. Then I heard footsteps. JD leaned in. Little Ibrahim, maybe 6 or 7, stood there with one mango in his hands, the last on a dying tree. He had climbed it for himself, but instead, he gave it to me. Her hands paused over the pot. He didn't say a word, just placed it on the ground near my feet, then walked away like it cost him nothing. She looked up. But it cost him everything. JD's throat tightened. You didn't just feed him, he said quietly. You created someone who fed me truth. Mama Hawa looked at him, eyes steady, the way only elders look at those they've already forgiven. Children watch. They don't remember what we say. They remember what we choose. JD lowered his gaze. His hand reached for a spoon beside the stove, then stopped. His voice broke. In my country, we feed children fear and call it strength. We teach them to take. We raise them not to give away the mango, but to own the whole orchard. He turned his face away, but not fast enough. Mama saw the shimmer in his eyes. This place didn't give me a mango, he whispered. It gave me a mirror. Mama didn't respond. She only handed him a folded cloth to wipe his face, not to erase the tears, but to bless them. Outside, Traoré's voice was faint, laughing with the children, showing them something in the dirt. JD listened. Every note of that laughter echoed with the boy who gave away his last fruit. A child raised by leaves and dust and love, stronger than politics. The fire crackled again. JD didn't speak for a long time, and when he did, it wasn't to Mama. It was to the smoke curling toward the ceiling. If the Senate chamber had even 1 ounce of this kitchen's grace, maybe we wouldn't be tearing ourselves apart. Mama Hawa didn't answer. She simply placed a mango on the table beside him. The next one, she said, is yours to give. By late afternoon, the light softened into gold. The dry season had stripped the trees, but the old baobab still stood proud at the edge of the village, its thick trunk gnarled like the back of a grandfather's hand, its branches outstretched like it had nothing left to offer except shade. That somehow was enough. JD and Mama Hawa walked slowly toward it. The path was silent, except for the rustle of dry leaves and the distant voices of children skipping rope with frayed cloth. Traoré stayed behind, letting the moment belong to them. When they reached the tree, JD lowered himself to the earth, brushing away pebbles like he was settling into something sacred. Mama Hawa moved slower, easing herself down with the help of her walking stick. They sat in the cool hush of the baobab's shadow. JD looked up at its wide, empty branches. It reminds me of the Senate, he said. Mama chuckled. Empty? No, JD smiled faintly. Ancient, majestic, full of promise, yet so often quiet when it should speak. She nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. But this tree speaks. You just have to be still long enough to listen. They sat for a moment in that silence. Then softly she said, You listened to someone the world tried to ignore? That means your heart is still open. JD blinked. No press conference, no cameras, no applause. Just one sentence, spoken like a blessing, felt like a judgment he was finally ready to pass on himself. That boy, Mama continued, used to cry in his sleep. I'd pretend not to hear. He didn't want to be seen breaking. But in the morning, I always left water by his bed, and mango leaves to chew. That was my way of saying, I see you, even when you don't want me to. JD swallowed hard. We have boys like that back home too, he said. They cry in silence. We hand them guns instead of leaves. Mama reached over and touched the back of his hand. Her skin was rough like bark, but warm with memory. Then teach them different. JD met her eyes. They were still sharp, still clear, still stronger than most of the committee hearings he'd ever sat through. Your name will be whispered in the halls of Congress, he said. Not for power, but for presence. Because you did what none of us could, raise a man without bitterness. She looked at him unmoved. I don't need them to whisper my name. Just teach them to say Ibrahim's without flinching. JD smiled sadly. I can do that. Then do more. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of smoke and tamarind. A bird landed on one of the baobab's limbs, chirped once, then flew off again. Mama Hawa leaned back against the tree, her body curved like it had known that shape for generations. JD placed his palm on the trunk beside him, the bark cool and coarse under his fingertips. Do you know what they call you in Washington? He asked. She shook her head. The woman who raised the flame. She closed her eyes. Tell them the flame didn't come from me, she whispered. It came from hunger. I just held the match. As the sun dipped low, casting shadows long and solemn, JD sat still. No staff, no suit, no agenda, just a student, as he had told her. Learning the final lesson of the day. And when he stood to leave, he didn't shake her hand. He kissed it. Because some moments aren't for politics, some are for memory, and some, like this one, are for the soil beneath the baobab tree, where truth was never shouted but always heard. The morning sun rose softly over the village, casting warm light through thin curtains and onto the sleeping form of Mama Hawa. Her chest no longer rose and fell. Her hand, still curled gently around the faded scarf she had once wrapped around a boy's wounded arm, rested on her heart. The same heart that had raised a president and humbled a senator had finally fallen quiet, in peace, not in pain. There was no screaming when they found her, no sirens, only silence. A kind of hush that fell over the village like a shared breath held too long. Traoré was the first to enter. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt at her bedside, kissed her forehead, and whispered, You waited long enough. Then he sat on the floor beside her, scarf still cradled in her hands, and wept, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as a son. J.D. Vance stood just outside the door, hat removed, eyes closed. He hadn't known her long, but she had shown him more truth than most Senate hearings ever had. He felt like he should say something, but the moment didn't want speeches. It only wanted stillness. Later that day, the village women began preparing her body. There were no cameras, no microphones, no headlines. The world didn't need to see this. This moment wasn't for them. It was for the hands that folded cloth over skin, for the voices that hummed songs of crossing, for the barefoot children who laid mango leaves at the threshold, and for the earth that would soon receive her, not as a public figure, but as a mother who gave until the giving was done. Traoré refused all press. He shut off his phone. J.D. followed suit. The burial site was under the very baobab tree where J.D. had once sat, listening to her speak about mangoes and scars. Now she would rest beneath it, the roots wrapping her the way her arms once had wrapped orphans. Elders dug the earth slowly, no machines, just calloused hands and memory. The choir was small, 5 women who had sung with her in church for decades. Their voices cracked, not from lack of strength, but from the weight of love too deep for perfect pitch. The song wasn't in English or French. It didn't need to be. It carried grief the way water carries ashes, gently, unforgettably. When it came time for the final blessing, Traoré stepped forward. I have spoken before kings and congressmen, he began, voice thick. But today I speak as the child of a woman who gave me everything without ever asking for anything in return. He bent down, placed the scarf beside her body, and whispered, You gave this to me when I was bleeding. I give it back now, because the world still is. J.D. didn't cry until that moment, but when he saw the scarf, he broke, quietly, fully, like something inside him had finally been granted permission. As they laid her to rest, the wind picked up. The baobab tree rustled gently overhead. The earth accepted her without protest, and the village, so often forgotten by maps, held its breath, then exhaled in song. No cameras, no headlines, just earth and memory, and the final goodbye of a woman whose hands had shaped nations. The sun had barely risen when the children began to gather. They came barefoot, dressed in white cotton, eyes wide with reverence and quiet confusion. Some were too young to understand the fullness of what this day meant, but they all understood one thing. Today, they were carrying Mama Hawa. The small wooden coffin, hand-carved from a mango tree by the village carpenters, rested lightly on their shoulders. It was not heavy. She had never been heavy. Even in death, she seemed to float on memory more than wood. The procession began slowly, with no need for direction. The path was known by heart. They walked the road she had walked 1,000 times before, past the school where she once swept floors, past the well where she had fetched water long after her knees should have stopped bending, past the mango tree where she had once scolded boys for climbing too high. Today, that same tree bowed quietly in the wind. Behind the children walked two men in silence. Ibrahim Traoré had removed his jacket. His feet were bare, his eyes swollen from grief but steady. Beside him walked J.D. Vance, also barefoot, the dust clinging to his soles like history. The villagers had offered him shoes, but he had refused. "Let me walk as she walked," he'd said. "Let me feel the ground she made sacred." No cameras followed them, no journalists, no politics, just the low murmur of village hymns and the shuffling of feet over red earth. The world didn't need to watch this to be changed by it. This wasn't meant for headlines. It was meant for healing. As they neared the resting place beneath the baobab tree, the crowd began to hum a hymn without words, a sound of mourning shaped like wind in old stories. The children lowered the coffin gently to a raised platform, draped in simple cloth. No gold, no marble, just cotton and care. J.D. stepped forward. In his hand was a small worn object, a silver lapel pin, an American flag. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at the coffin, then at Traoré. "I don't know if I have the right," he said softly, voice barely above the breeze, "but I do know I have the need." He leaned down, hands trembling slightly, and clipped the pin to the corner of the cloth covering her casket. "This," he whispered, "is from a country that never knew you, but now honors you. Because you gave us something we'd forgotten, how to listen, how to lead with love." No one clapped. No one needed to. Traoré stepped beside him and placed his hand over J.D.'s. For a moment, the two men stood in stillness, one who had been raised by her hands and one whose heart had been changed by her words. The village elder approached with a bowl of water and sprinkled it lightly over the coffin. A symbolic washing of dust, of sorrow, of silence. Then the children each stepped forward one by one, placing mango leaves, one for every year she had lived. When the last child stepped back, there were 85. As the ground received her, the hymn rose again, higher this time, not in despair, but in gratitude. The baobab leaves shivered above, the roots reaching down. They did not bury a woman that day. They planted a story. The air in the auditorium was thick with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for applause, only attention. No spotlight, no stage props. Just a plain wooden podium and two men standing side by side, their suits still carrying faint traces of the red dust from Burkina Faso. J.D. Vance adjusted the microphone, then stepped back. This was not his moment. Ibrahim Traoré moved forward slowly, hands steady, voice low but unwavering. In his fingers, he held something delicate, a faded cloth scarf, frayed at the edges, soft with age. He raised it into the light. Its shape fluttered slightly in the air, like a memory refusing to be still. "This," he began, "was once wrapped around my wounds by a woman who had no medicine, no wealth, no power, just love." The room held its breath. "She swept floors so I could dream. She boiled leaves so I could eat. She sacrificed what little she had over and over, without asking for thanks." He paused, eyes scanning the front row, where J.D. sat next to a group of girls from East Cleveland, their braided hair decorated with beads that clicked when they nodded. "She gave everything," he said slowly, "when she had nothing." Then, holding the scarf above his head like a banner, his voice broke free from its restraint. "Now we will give everything back." The room rose in unison, not to clap, to stand in witness. The screen behind him flickered to life. On it appeared a name in bold, handwritten script: the Mama Hawa Foundation. Below it, the mission: empowering rural girls in Africa and inner-city youth in America. through education, safety, and dignity. JD stepped up beside him again, his voice quiet but clear. We live in different countries. But what we owe her, what we owe women like her, is the same. It starts with classrooms, with mentors, with safe places to sleep, and it does not stop there. Traoré turned to him, then back to the crowd. You cannot repay a debt of love with words, only with work. The crowd now included more than Ohio's press and politicians. There were pastors, mothers, veterans, teachers, kids who had taken 3 buses to get here because someone told them, you need to hear this. Outside the hall, it had started to snow. Inside, the room warmed with the glow of something that wasn't just announcement, but vow. In the back row, a girl no older than 11 leaned toward her aunt and whispered, She's still helping people, isn't she? Her aunt nodded. She always will. The sun hung low over the Capitol Mall, casting a soft golden hue across the gathering. A quiet reverence filled the crowd as the covering veil was drawn back, revealing the statue in its full form. A woman carved in bronze, one hand gently resting on a young boy's shoulder, the other clutching a scarf caught mid-motion as if suspended in a breeze that only she could feel. Her face was not youthful, not regal, but worn and wise, etched with lines of sacrifice, dignity, and tenderness. Mama Hawa, not a name many had heard 10 years ago. Now her likeness stood where generals and presidents had long monopolized the marble and metal of American reverence. She wore no crown, held no flag, claimed no battlefield. Yet something in her stance felt victorious, quietly defiant. School groups filled the front rows. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, tugged at his teacher's sleeve, squinting up at the statue. He leaned in, voice barely above a whisper, trying to put words around the ache in his chest. Is that his mother? He asked, glancing toward the bronze boy beside her. Or everyone's? The teacher didn't answer right away. She looked at the statue, her own eyes softening. Maybe both, she said finally. She fed one child, but she raised a world. Nearby, J.D. Vance stood with Traoré in a line of dignitaries, but neither man spoke. This wasn't a day for speeches, not here. Instead, the silence held everything, the sound of meaning unspoken, of sacrifice honored. Parents took photos, elders held hands, and one by one, children stepped forward and left small tokens at the base of the statue. Paper cranes, beads, handwritten notes. A girl left a mango. As the crowd thinned, a wind rustled through the National Mall, lifting fallen leaves and tugging gently at scarves and collars. It was as if the statue breathed, her scarf forever flying, forever reminding, forever reaching. The lights in the studio were dimmer than usual by request. No flashy graphics, no countdown theme. Just 2 chairs, 2 men, and one story left to tell. J.D. Vance sat beside Ibrahim Traoré, both men older now, their hair a little grayer, their movements slower but no less steady. Across from them, the journalist placed her cards down. She had planned a list of questions, but quickly realized none were necessary. This is your last joint appearance, she said. What do you want to leave with us? J.D. reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the now frayed scarf. The audience leaned in. The camera zoomed closer. He didn't unfold it, just held it in his lap, gently rubbing its worn threads between his fingers. She never made a speech, and he said. She didn't march or hold press conferences. She never wrote a book, but she fed a hungry boy. He paused. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. And when you feed someone, J.D. continued, you're not just giving food. You're telling them, you matter. You deserve to live. That message changed him. He gestured to Traoré. And he changed me. That's how this works. Quiet acts echo. Traoré looked toward the audience, his expression unreadable at first, until his eyes glistened. He nodded. I used to think power was about the ability to move people, he said. Now I think it's about the ability to still them, to make them feel. That's what Mama Hawa did. She made the world pause and feel. No one spoke, not even the host. Somewhere in the audience, a sniffle broke the stillness. Then slowly, as if led by something unspoken, the audience stood. A standing ovation without fanfare, without cue cards, just gratitude. The screen faded not to commercials, but to a single sentence. White on black. She fed one. The rest learned to feed others. It was a quiet evening in the village, the kind where the air feels heavy with memory and the stars arrive one by one, not all at once. J.D. Vance walked slowly down the path he had first traveled years ago, the one that had led him not to a palace, but to a humble home where a woman had changed the course of his life without ever trying to. Now she rested beneath the earth of that same village. The baobab tree they had planted after the funeral stood strong and full, its roots deep and wide, its leaves whispering in the wind. J.D. stepped closer to the grave, pausing to brush a few fallen petals off the stone. His hand lingered on the carved letters of her name. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he listened. The crickets, the wind, the faint laughter of children in the distance. Then, kneeling beside the stone, he placed the scarf on the ground, just at the base of the tree. Its colors had faded, but its fabric still held the shape of care. "I came to change one school," he said quietly, voice thick, "but I'm the one who got educated." He stood, breathing deep, taking in the scent of mango trees and smoke, of earth and memory. The wind tugged gently at his jacket, and for a moment he thought he heard her voice in it, soft, amused, loving. Then he turned, walking back down the path. Each step away from the grave was a step towards something larger. The village would sleep tonight, the baobab would stand, and somewhere in America, in a city yet unnamed, a girl would sit down to her first day of class in a school bearing a name she did not yet know but would one day carry forward. The scarf stayed behind, fluttering ever so slightly in the breeze, a relic, a prayer, a promise, and the wind carried on, quiet, steady, alive. This story reminds us that true leadership begins not in power, but in compassion. A single act of kindness, feeding a hungry boy, can echo across continents, shaping nations and souls. Mama Hawa never sought recognition, yet her love became a legacy. It's a quiet force, the kind that builds futures. What's one act of kindness you received that still lives in you today? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.